Henry Maddox had no reason to suspect trouble. He'd spent 30 years in service: firefighter, union steward, family man. When he retired, he just wanted peace. That's what drew him to Willow Creek Estates. The place looked like a slice of heaven. Trimmed lawns, winding streets, and just enough space between homes to stretch your arms. The day he moved in, the sky was clear and the birds were in full chorus. He'd bought a weathered 2-story farmhouse that needed love. The porch sagged a little. The white paint was peeling, but Henry saw what it could be, not what it was. What he didn't see, what no real estate agent had warned him about, was the Homeowners Association. It didn't take long for the first letter to appear, typed, signed, and sealed in a bright white envelope. The ink practically dripped with politeness. It asked him to remove the non-standard mailbox he'd installed. Never mind that it was the same mailbox he'd used back in Montgomery County for 20 years, or that it still worked just fine. He chuckled. "All right," he muttered, thinking it was just some bored neighbor trying to prove they read the rule book. He replaced the mailbox. 3 days later, another letter. This one complained about the length of his grass, which hadn't yet reached ankle height. Then a warning about construction debris in the driveway, referring to 2 pieces of plywood, stacked neatly behind a planter. Henry wasn't annoyed, yet just confused. Then came a knock on the door. Colleen Barrister, HOA board president, stood there in a pastel pink blouse and heels that hadn't touched dirt in years. She introduced herself with a smile that looked like it hurt to maintain. "We just like to keep things uniform around here," she said. "It keeps the property values high." Henry offered her lemonade. She declined. Then next week Henry received 4 letters. By the end of the month, he'd collected 11 each, one stranger than the last. One accused him of unauthorized shade because a tree he planted cast a shadow on a neighbor's walkway for 10 minutes each afternoon. Another cited a noise complaint about hammering heard at noon when he was fixing a porch rail. Still, Henry kept calm. Years in firefighting taught him how to stay cool when the air got hot. But that calm wasn't mistaken for surrender. He started quietly keeping records, letters, dates, photos. He wasn't sure what for yet, just instinct. The oddest thing was how some neighbors began treating him. Friendly nods turned into tight-lipped stares. A woman walking her dog paused across the street, fumbled with her phone, and snapped a picture of his yard. Another man, mid-50s, and pale as winter milk, crossed the street just to avoid passing Henry's driveway. One afternoon, Henry stood by the curb, sipping sweet tea, when he noticed something odd. A small black camera had been bolted to the lamppost across from his house. He hadn't seen it the day before. It blinked red. He walked to it casually and examined the wiring, clearly hooked up by someone without a permit. The lens pointed squarely at his front door. He turned back toward his home and spotted Colleen on her porch across the green, her arms folded, eyes locked on him. No words exchanged, just silence that weighed heavy. A week later, he received a letter not from the HOA, but from their contracted attorney. The phrasing was different this time. It wasn't about mailboxes or law care. It said, "Continued violations may constitute grounds for legal action or eviction, per community enforcement policy." Henry sat in his living room that night, the document spread across his lap. On the table next to him lay every photo, every complaint, every scribbled note from the last 3 months. The sun had long set, but he hadn't turned on the lights. Something had shifted. This wasn't about rules anymore. It felt like they wanted him gone. But here's the thing, they didn't. Understand about Henry Maddox: he didn't run from fire, he ran into it. And when he came out, he usually had something important in his hands. That night, he stood up, gathered every paper, and placed them into a manila folder labeled Phase 1. He looked out the window at the blinking red light across the street. If they thought they could burn him out, they had no idea what kind of fuel they were playing with. Morning in Willow Creek Estates looked peaceful on the outside. Neighbors waved, dogs barked softly, and sprinklers hissed across freshly trimmed lawns. But Henry Maddox had started seeing beneath the surface. Behind those tidy picket fences was something rotten. Henry kept to himself that morning, watching from his porch as a gray SUV rolled by, slow to slow. It paused just long enough at the edge of his lawn for the driver to scribble something down. He recognized the driver, Trevor Ratcliffe, HOA board member, and Colleen's most loyal foot soldier. Trevor had the kind of face that always looked like he was suppressing a sneeze. Clean polo shirt tucked into jeans that were a little too snug. Henry gave him a friendly nod. Trevor didn't return it. That same afternoon, Henry got a new notice slipped into his mailbox. Not mailed, hand-delivered. Suspicion of commercial activity on residential property. He read it twice. Apparently, Trevor had reported him for operating a construction business, based on the presence of his toolboxes and sawhorses in the garage. Never mind that Henry had no clients, no business license, and no plans to do anything but build a new pergola. The notice went on to list several so-called infractions: failure to obtain paint color approval, improper trash bin placement, and visible hardware left outdoors. Overnight, the visible hardware in question, a single shovel leaning against the side of the house, at the bottom, In small print, it said, "Repeat violations may result in daily fines of $250 per item, per day." Henry folded the notice slowly. He wasn't angry. He was beyond that. The edges of his mind started to sharpen, like steel being honed out that night. He attended his first HOA meeting since moving in. The clubhouse looked like a wedding reception venue. Tables lined with cheap muffins, lukewarm coffee, and HOA board. Members seated like royalty behind a folding table. Colleen sat dead center, arms folded, lips tight. Trevor flanked her left, looking smug. Henry waited for public comment. When his turn came, he walked to the microphone in a clean-collared shirt, holding a folder under one arm. He cleared his throat. "I just want to ask a question," he said. "Evenly is this neighborhood governed by rules? Or by whoever shouts the loudest?" Several neighbors shifted in their chairs. "I've received 15 notices in 3 weeks, most of them completely baseless. I came here to retire, not to get interrogated every time I plant a flower." Colleen cut him off, her voice full of frosting and disdain. "Mr. Maddox, we take community standards very seriously. If you feel the rules are being misapplied, you're welcome to appeal." Henry smiled faintly. "I already am." Then calmly he took out a small recorder, placed it on the podium, and hit play. The room fell silent. Colleen's voice came out first, from a previous encounter. "Frankly, Mr. Maddox, say if you can't follow the rules, maybe Willow Creek isn't the right fit for you." Then Trevor's voice, from a day ago, muttered near Henry's fence line, "He's just another flipper. We'll bury him in paperwork until he gets the message." Colleen's face froze. Trevor looked like he'd swallowed his own tongue, stopped the playback, and returned the recorder to his pocket. "I came here to enjoy my retirement," he said, "but if you want to play games, I've got time." He walked out before anyone could respond. The next morning, Henry found a new surprise. His trash bin had been pushed into the middle of the street. Someone had jammed a nail into the tire of his truck. An across the street. The camera on the lamppost had been replaced with a newer one, bigger, with clearer resolution. Still pointed directly at his house. Henry called a contact from his firefighter, Dezason, who'd since become a lawyer. "Hey Rick," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Got a minute? I might be walking into something, and I'd rather walk in prepared." Rick listened as Henry laid it all out, step by step. "Sounds like they're setting you up," Rick finally said. "But if they want to bring heat, they'd better hope they're fireproof." Henry hung up, leaned back in his chair, and looked out the window. He wasn't just keeping notes anymore. He was gathering ammunition, and something in the air told him the fire was only getting started. The morning started like any other, birds chirping, coffee steaming, a breeze pushing through the wind chimes on Henry Maddox's porch. Nothing about it suggested that by nightfall, everything he'd built would be reduced to ash. He'd spent most of that Saturday installing new shelving in his detached workshop. It wasn't fancy, just a small wooden structure behind the main house where he kept his tools, spare lumber, and a few of his late wife's keepsakes. The kind of place a man retreats to when the world starts barking too loud. By 7 p.m., Henry locked the door and headed inside. A chicken pot pie warmed in the oven. He sat at the table, flipping through an old yearbook, when something caught his eye out the back window. Smoke. At first, it was faint, rising slowly above the tree line. Henry blinked, thinking maybe it was a neighbor grilling. Then he heard a pop, sharp and unnatural, another, then a crackling noise. He knew too well. He ran outside. The entire workshop was engulfed, orange flames licking up the walls. Smoke poured into the sky like a signal flare. A loud bang sent debris into the air, a canister exploding. The smell of burning oil and scorched plastic hit hard. Without thinking, Henry grabbed a garden hose and charged forward, trying to douse the edges. It was pointless. The fire was alive, hungry, and it had already devoured too much. By the time the fire department arrived, it was gone. Nothing remained but the smoldering frame of what used to be his sanctuary. The fire captain, a younger guy named Parker, approached him as the crew cooled the wreckage. "Electrical, maybe," Parker offered. "We'll know more once the report's done." Henry shook his head slowly. There was no power running to that structure, just a solar light. Parker raised an eyebrow. Later that evening, while the last hoses were being rolled up, Trevor Ratcliffe strolled by on the sidewalk. He didn't say a word, just stared, smirked, then kept walking. Colleen didn't come by, but Henry saw her blinds twitch around 9 p.m., right as the last fire engine pulled away. Henry waited until midnight, then took a flashlight and stepped into the rubble. He wasn't sure what he hoped to find. Everything important had burned. Tools, photos, the cedar box with his wife's letters. But as he sifted through the ash, something caught the light. A warped, half-melted cylinder. He knelt down and picked it up with a gloved hand. It was the top half of a portable gas canister, one he didn't own. He'd never seen it before. He turned it over and noticed part of a faded label still intact. A red diamond with a flame symbol. That night, he placed the canister on the kitchen table beside his growing folder of letters and photos. Then he grabbed his phone and dialed. "Lisa Moreno," a voice answered. "Lisa, it's Henry. You still run private fire investigations?" She hesitated. "I do, But you know I've got a wait list. This one's personal, he said. I think someone said it. Lisa didn't need more. She'd worked with Henry back when she was new in the department. She'd seen his instincts in action. Text me the address, she said. I'll be there by Wednesday. By morning, a new letter arrived. Not a sympathy card. Not a neighbor. Reaching out. It was from the HOA. Due to the recent fire event on your property, we are requesting an inspection of your remaining structures to ensure safety compliance. If unapproved materials or unauthorized storage is found, fines may apply. Henry didn't even finish reading it. He folded it and tucked it behind the burnt gas canister on the table. At noon, a city inspector arrived. Not scheduled, not requested, said he was responding to an anonymous complaint. He poked around for half an hour, took photos of Henry's porch, and left with a tight nod. Never once mentioned the fire. That night, Henry didn't sleep. He sat by the window, eyes on the street lamp, watching shadows pass under the dim glow. A neighborhood that once looked like paradise now had the quiet menace of a powder keg. He knew what was happening. This wasn't about compliance. They were trying to push him out, but they'd picked the wrong man. They didn't know the story wasn't ending here. It was just reaching the part where everything changes. Wednesday came with an overcast sky, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Henry stood at the end of his driveway, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the silver SUV pulling up. Out stepped Lisa Moreno, hair pulled back, clipboard in hand, and that same calm intensity she used to wear back in the engine company. She glanced at the scorched remains of the workshop. They didn't just want to scare you, she said, walking past the caution tape. They wanted to erase something. Henry didn't respond. He just watched as she moved through the rubble like a surgeon, snapping photos, scraping up samples, and bagging what little was left of the gas canister. Every so often, she paused, furrowing her brow. Accelerant's not a question, she said. You don't get burn patterns like this from old wiring and bad luck. Henry nodded slowly. Can you prove it? I can do better than that, she said. I can track the purchase if they were sloppy. Before she left, she handed Henry a flash drive. Start backing everything up. Emails, letters, even phone calls. If you can record Have you seen these HOA setups before? This one's got muscle behind its paperwork. That evening, as Henry went through his files, he found something strange in his emails. An alert from his home security provider. The system had logged a temporary disconnect the night of the fire, lasting exactly 12 minutes. Just enough time for someone to sneak in and out of the backyard undetected, but there was more. Buried in the logs, he found a failed remote access. Attempts. Someone had tried to override the camera feed through the online portal, and the IP address. It traced back to a nearby house. 3 streets over, the name on the account? Trevor Ratcliffe. Henry stared at the screen. The air felt heavier now, like smoke still lingered from a fire no one else could smell. He printed the logs, filed them away, and placed a call to Rick, his lawyer friend. Rick, I've got a situation, he said, and it's starting to smell like conspiracy. The next day brought more pressure. A letter from his insurance company arrived. Denial of coverage due to negligence and unauthorized structures. The report they referenced, provided by the HOA's property manager. Henry's jaw clenched. They weren't just trying to get rid of him anymore. They were choking off every support system he had. At 3 p.m., while Henry was on the phone with Rick, a knock echoed from the front door. He opened it to find a man in a crisp blazer and too white smile. Mr. Maddox. Name's Brent Sawyer. I'm a real estate investor. I represent clients looking to develop properties in this area. Henry blinked. You're lost. I don't think so, Brent said smoothly. We'd like to make you a cash offer on your home. Above market rate. We can close in 2 weeks. Henry narrowed his eyes. Did Colleen send you? Brent didn't answer, just slipped a card into Henry's hand. Think about it. Some fights aren't worth the energy. Everyone's got a price. Henry held the card between 2 fingers like it was coated in grease. You tell your clients, he said, voice low, if they want this house, they can come build their dream home on top of my cold foundation. But I'm not selling. Brent's smile faltered. Things might get difficult. Henry stepped closer. They already are. That night, he installed 2 new motion lights and hardwired backup storage for every camera on the property. He added a hidden trail cam to a tree behind the fence line and mounted a blinking decoy in the front yard. Let them think that was the only one. Then, as if the day hadn't done enough damage, he got a call from the city's fire inspector. Official report had been filed. Find anything? Henry asked. There was a long pause on the other end. The cause is listed as inconclusive, the inspector finally said, but off the record, nothing about that fire made sense. No power, no lightning, no open flames reported. I've got to follow the book, but I'd keep your eyes open. Henry hung up, staring at the ashes through the window. They'd tried to ruin him with flames, but what they didn't know, what they'd never understand, was that some people don't fear fire. Some people are the fire, and Henry Maddox had just begun to burn. Henry Maddox wasn't one to make noise without reason. He liked facts, he liked proof, but after weeks of being pushed, threatened, and set on fire literally, he was done playing quietly. Lisa returned the following Monday with a thin but loaded folder. It's all here, she said, sliding it across the table. Residue analysis confirms an accelerant petroleum-based, likely commercial. Not only that, the specific canister found in your wreckage matches a model sold in just 2 local stores. Guess who bought one 3 days before the fire? Henry flipped the page. Colleen Barrister's husband? Lisa leaned back. Security footage from the hardware store shows him loading it into his trunk. Same license plate. Timestamped. Henry said nothing. He didn't smile. He just opened his drawer, added Lisa's report to the ever-growing folder, and clicked it shut. He called Rick. Time to file. Rick didn't ask if Henry was sure. He'd already seen enough. By the end of the week, Henry's lawsuit was in motion: civil damages, property destruction, harassment, retaliation by a governing body, and under it all, the suspicion of arson. But Henry didn't stop there. He'd been reviewing the HOA bylaws line by line, and what he discovered was gold. A clause buried deep under Article 4 gave the board sweeping discretion for community improvement projects. But it also stated that no board may profit financially or receive personal benefit from respawning, transfers, or redevelopment of any lot. Henry cross-referenced that with a land use proposal he obtained through a friend at City Hall. 2 weeks before the fire, the HOA submitted interest in acquiring the corner lot behind his home as property for a community garden expansion. That same garden would have connected directly to a newly proposed development site from a company, led by, of course, Brent Sawyer. Brent, the investor who came knocking after the fire. The whole thing stunk like gasoline. The next HOA meeting drew a full house. Henry sat in the back, arms folded, as Colleen droned on about dues and lawn care policies like nothing was happening. But something was. Word had begun to spread. Neighbors had questions. One older couple stood up and asked why their guest passes were revoked without notice. Another man asked about the surveillance cameras popping up on common ground. Colleen waved them off with tight smiles and vague answers. Then Henry stood. I'd like to ask the board something, he said, his voice steady. Colleen forced a polite tone. Go ahead, Mr. Maddox. Did the board vote on the community garden proposal filed last month? Colleen blinked. That's not under current discussion. Then how did it end up on a development blueprint connected to a private real estate firm? A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Colleen shifted. We've had interest in improvements. Yes, but no action has been taken. Henry held up a copy of the city document, marked and time-stamped. Then maybe the board can explain why this was submitted. My lot is in transition 10 days before the fire that destroyed my workshop. Colleen's jaw tightened. From the side of the room, another voice spoke. I have a question, said a man. No one expected Tom Kinley, former board secretary. He'd resigned quietly months ago. Tom stepped forward holding a flash drive. I've got emails. From Colleen, from Trevor. Internal messages talking about making certain properties uninhabitable. One of them even says, quote, we can't wait for him to break the rules forever. Sometimes the board needs to be creative. Henry didn't move. He just watched Colleen's face drain of color. You all wanted a garden, Tom continued, but Colleen wanted a payday, and she didn't care who she had to step over, burn out to get it. The room exploded. Residents shouted over one another. Some left their seats, demanding Colleen step down. Trevor slipped out the side door without a word. Colleen stood frozen, blinking like a statue suddenly hit by a flashlight. Henry said nothing more. He turned and walked out. That night, Rick called with an update. The judge accepted the lawsuit and granted a protective order against further HOA retaliation. He said, we've got enough to go public. You ready for that? Henry looked out the window. A few houses down, someone had taken down their HOA-approved flagpole. Another neighbor had pulled their car into the grass. On purpose? I think the neighborhood's already waking up, he said. Let's light the rest. The courthouse sat at the edge of town, a tan brick building with tired steps and tight security. On the morning of Henry Maddox's first hearing, it buzzed with unfamiliar energy. Word had gotten around. The man who stood up to the HOA, the man whose workshop mysteriously burned down, the man who came back not with fists but files. Henry walked through the front doors wearing a charcoal gray suit. It wasn't expensive. It was clean, pressed, and respectful like everything else about him. Lisa Moreno followed close behind with a hardshell evidence case. Rick trailed them, briefcased in one hand, calm confidence in the other. Inside, a crowd had formed. Not all of them knew Henry personally, but they knew the story. Many had HOA scars of their own. Overpriced violations, petty fines, threats buried in friendly reminders. But today wasn't just about him. Today was about pulling back the curtain. The courtroom itself was standard pharos of benches, polished wood, and a judge who looked like she'd seen it all before. At the defendant's table sat Colleen Barrister and her attorney, a lean man with slicked hair who kept adjusting his cuffs like he'd rather be somewhere else. The case was introduced. Civil suit, harassment, property damage, retaliatory governance. The air in the room shifted. Rick stood and opened simply. This is not a case about bad grass or mailboxes. This is about a homeowner who was targeted, intimidated, and pushed toward destruction by the very people who claimed to protect the community. He moved to the center, hands steady. What happens when a group meant to preserve peace becomes the one stoking chaos? Then came the exhibits. Rick brought up the notices one after another. The recordings, the camera logs, the footage of Colleen's husband buying the gas canister, and finally, the emails from Tom Kinley, the former board member. One, in particular, made the entire room shift. If this doesn't move Maddox out, the fire might. Colleen's attorney objected. Speculation, out of context, but it was already too late. The words echoed louder than any gavel strike. Then Lisa took the stand. She walked the jury through the fire scene, explaining chemical residues, directional burn lines, and how the accelerant was never something used in routine home maintenance. Whoever said it wanted complete destruction, she said, and they knew what they were doing. Colleen's lawyer tried to cast doubt, suggested the evidence was circumstantial, that Henry had created the fire himself for insurance. Henry didn't react until the suggestion came that he'd wanted to frame the HOA. Rick calmly stood and offered a final piece of evidence: the denied insurance claim itself. If this was a fraud, my client would have to be the worst fraudster in America, because he didn't get a dime from his insurance company. He paid for repairs himself, out of pocket, while the people responsible laughed from their lawn chairs. Then it was Henry's turn. He stepped up to the stand with the same look he used to wear in burning buildings, focused, steady. He spoke plainly. I moved to Willow Creek for quiet, to put my tools down and enjoy what years I had left, but from the first week, I was treated like I didn't belong. He recounted the harassment, the fines, the broken tire, the fire. I lost a piece of my life in that workshop. My wife's letters, my retirement project, my peace. He paused, letting the silence settle. I'm not angry because they burned my property. I'm angry because they thought I'd roll over. I spent 30 years running into fires. This time I didn't have to. The fire came to me. He stepped down, voice unshaken. Later, the jury returned to deliberate. Hours passed, long ones. The waiting room outside was filled with low whispers. Neighbors had come to watch. Former board members stayed, trying to look uninvolved. Finally, the bailiff called them back in. Everyone rose. The judge read the verdict slowly. The HOA was found liable on all counts. A wave moved through the courtroom. Henry was awarded full damages, loss, emotional distress, punitive compensation. The total came to over $1.3 million. As part of the settlement, the court ordered a full internal audit of the HOA and Colleen. She was to be removed from the board immediately. Outside, reporters waited. Cameras flashed. But Henry didn't say much. Just walked down the steps, folder in hand. A reporter asked, Mr. Maddox, what will you do with the money? He looked back at the courthouse. Something that lasts longer than smoke. Colleen Barrister didn't return to Willow Creek after the verdict. She quietly sold her home through a proxy agent, disappeared without a press statement, and was last seen clearing out her office late one evening with her head down and sunglasses on. Trevor Ratcliffe resigned the same week, citing family issues. No one bought that, not even his family. But Henry Maddox wasn't celebrating with champagne. He was at home, standing in the skeletal frame of his new workshop, hammer in hand, rebuilding it himself, every beam, every board, this time, with fire-resistant materials, and every corner wired with cameras and reinforced with steel. It wasn't revenge, it was permanence. 2 weeks after the trial, the HOA posted a letter, this time not to Henry but to the entire community. It was an apology, court-ordered, printed in plain font and nailed to the clubhouse door. We recognize the distress caused to Mr. Maddox, and we accept the judgment of the court. The Willow Creek HOA board will undergo restructuring and mandatory compliance review effective immediately. No signature, no name, just a hollow stamp of compliance. But it was enough to stir something in the neighborhood. A wave of change swept through the block. The Jones family down the street repainted their shutters in bright teal, something that had once been fined $100 a day. Across the way, old Mr. Kelton put garden gnomes on his lawn, 14 of them, just because he could now. The fear was gone, replaced by something else, something neighbors hadn't felt in years. Ownership. People started saying hello again. Children played in driveways. And Henry Heath became a kind of quiet legend. One evening, as the sun fell behind the tree line, a stranger knocked on Henry's door. She looked nervous, mid-30s, tired eyes, holding a folder under her arm. Mr. Maddox, he nodded. My name's Rachel. I live 3 towns over. Our HOAs, not as bold as yours, but they've started doing the same things. Threats, illegal cameras. I saw your story online. She opened the folder. Letters, photos, a video clip of a board member yelling on a sidewalk. I don't know what to do, but you seemed like someone who might. Henry looked through the materials. Carefully, you documenting everything. She nodded. Trying. He walked into the back room and returned with a new manila folder, labeled Template Use if Cornered. He handed it to her. Start with this, he said, and don't back down. They count on silence. Rachel left with more hope than she'd come in with. The next morning, a package arrived at Henry's door. No return address. Inside was a small wooden box charred around the edges. It had been salvaged by one of the local firefighters during the workshop blaze and tucked away in the station's lost items bin. Inside were some of his wife's letters, a little blackened, still legible. He sat for a long time with those in his lap. Later, he took the settlement, checked not all of it, but enough and put it toward launching a small nonprofit with Rick and Lisa's help. Homeowners First, a free, legal aid and guidance network for residents battling rogue HOAs. They operated out of Henry's rebuilt shop, where the walls were lined with maps, notes, and folders from other homeowners across the state. Every new case was pinned with a tag, and marked with a small red flag. The funny thing, Henry had no plans to start any of this, but now that it had begun, he wasn't about to stop. Late one evening, a new board member from the restructured Willow Creek HOA knocked on his door. "We were wondering if you'd consider running for a community seat," she asked nervously. Henry shook his head. "No interest in politics. I've got enough fires to fight already." But before she left, he handed her a folder. It wasn't a lawsuit, just recommendations how to protect privacy, how to handle disputes fairly, how to avoid becoming the next Colleen. She thanked him. He just nodded. Later that night, a porch light flickered across the street. Then another, not in warning, in recognition. They weren't watching him anymore. They were watching out because of him and Henry Maddox. Once burned and nearly broken, now stood at the center of a neighborhood not just rebuilt, but reborn. 6 months had passed since the courtroom doors closed behind Henry Maddox, but inside Willow Creek Estates, the ripple effects of that verdict were still unfolding. The HOA board was now a completely different cast, younger, quieter, and more interested in community potlucks than punitive citations. They no longer handed out violations for fence paint or mailbox styles. Instead, they sent out newsletters asking what residents wanted changed. At the heart of it all was Henry's told, retold, and passed around like a neighborhood campfire legend. But Henry never once called himself a hero. He preferred hammers. 2 headlines. Every morning, he opened the doors of his new workshop, now fully rebuilt with insulated walls, fireproof panels, and backup battery power. It stood exactly where the old one had been, but this time, it was surrounded by flowering shrubs and a small wooden sign etched with 2 words, reclaimed ground. Inside, blueprints lined one wall, dozens of them. They weren't for his own property anymore. They were sketches and site plans for elderly couples across the county, single parents with HOA complaints, and veterans dealing with forced compliance threats. Henry was helping people modify their homes safely on their terms and guiding them on how to stand their ground if their HOA ever tried to play. The nonprofit he'd started with Lisa and Rick Homeowners First had quietly gone statewide. A few volunteers, a couple part-time lawyers, and a network of former board members turned whistleblowers had turned the little office into a force. Every letter from a new homeowner in trouble was posted on a corkboard behind Henry's desk. Dozens came in each week. One, from a retired teacher in Arizona, stood out. "They fined me for flying my husband's funeral flag. Your story gave me the courage to fight back. Thank you." Henry pinned that one in the center. One day, while reviewing a zoning complaint from another town, a black SUV rolled up to his driveway. Out stepped a man in a suit, not smug like Brent Sawyer, but cautious. "Mr. Maddox?" the man asked. "I'm with the state's Consumer Affairs Division. Your case triggered a wave of HOA investigations. A lot of people finally came forward. We were hoping to consult with you on a broader report, maybe even some legislative reform." Henry raised an eyebrow. "I'm no politician," he said. The man smiled. "That's exactly why we want you." Henry didn't give an answer right away. He never rushed decisions. But that night, while looking through an old metal box salvaged from the fire, he found something that made up his mind. It was a photo of his wife standing beside him, both of them holding paintbrushes, grinning. In front of the original house the day they first bought it, she had written on the back, "Make it yours. No matter what." That message echoed in him now more than ever. He called the man back and agreed to join the advisory panel on one condition: no titles, no speeches, just action. Back at Willow Creek, life had shifted. The neighbors who once whispered behind curtains now waved from their porches. One brought over peach cobbler. Another, a handwritten thank you note for bringing the soul back into the block. But Henry's favorite visitor came one Friday afternoon. A boy named Lucas, maybe 12 years old, came pedaling up the street on a squeaky bike, skidding to a stop at the foot of Henry's driveway. "Mr. Maddox," the boy asked, "is it true? You beat the HOA and built your house back yourself?" Henry looked at him, then nodded. The boy blinked, then grinned wide. "That's awesome. My dad says you're like Batman, but with power tools." Henry chuckled. "Well, tell your dad, I don't work at night." Lucas turned to leave, then paused. "When I grow up, I want to build stuff like you." Henry thought for a second, then walked into the garage, came back with a worn tool belt, small old but still sturdy. He handed it to the kid. "Then start with this." The boy rode off like he'd won the lottery. Henry watched him disappear down the block, then looked around his property. The grass was a little too long. A few boards needed sanding. The fence leaned slightly to one side. He smiled. It was perfect, because every inch of it was his, fought for, paid in sweat and fire, and earned on. And now, instead of silence or fear, there was laughter in the air, and the hum of a community finally waking up. Not all stories start with fire, but the best ones rise from it.